Otherwise, good morning and welcome to our first part of our training on managing your wastewater system into the future. Thank you all for making time to join this session. So before we get started today, we just have a few logistics to go over to make sure that this presentation goes as smoothly as possible. If you want to, okay, awesome. So, sorry, I have all my Teams notifications up here too. So the presentation today is through GoToTraining. So you have any questions or comments during our Q&A sections or during polls, please feel free to raise your hand. It's going to be at the bottom left corner of your screen. For the presentation, we recommend that you mute yourself unless asking a question or contributing to a discussion. And again, it's completely up to you whether or not you have your camera on. And if you're having issues with hearing or being heard, you can go to the settings button at the top right corner to choose how you hear us and how other people hear you. Also, you can just message in the chat if you're having any issues that you can't resolve. And at any point during the webinar, you are welcome to message in the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the entire presentation, and we'll have time as we go and at the end of each section to go through everything thoroughly. And lastly, you can access the PowerPoint by clicking that little file icon at the top, and you can download everything for today up there. And next slide. And then as a reminder, the session has been approved for 4 continuing education hours. So to receive the credits, you have to attend all 4 hours of the session. Make sure to register using your first and last name, which you guys already did, and a valid email. So we request that you participate in the polls, and then after the end of today's session, you'll receive an email in 30 days with your certificate indicating that you participated, and you'll receive your 4 CEUs. Next slide. And then just a little intro of the Environmental Finance Center Network. In case you didn't know, we're a collaborative organization consisting of universities and nonprofit entities that focus on finding creative solutions for financial challenges related to environmental protection and infrastructure in the United States, including its territories and the Navajo Nation. The EFC network works both collectively and through individual centers to address these issues. And the mission involves supporting both the public and private sectors by providing training, direct professional assistance, valuable resources, and proposing innovative policy ideas. So that's just a little bit of intro, and we'll go on to Austin's part of the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Melanie. And as you can hopefully see from this slide, Melanie and I will be tag teaming this 2-day training for y'all. I'll be covering today's content, and then Melanie will be covering tomorrow's. So the good news is, although you will be listening to each of us for 2 hours, at least you'll have 2 different voices over the course of the 2 days. So my name is Austin Thompson-Spain. I'm an associate director at the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. I have been with the UNC EFC for the last 5 years, kind of in different capacities. So I started as a project director, so the role that Melanie is currently in, went back to school, and then have recently returned as an assistant director. So this is really the stuff that I'm interested in is the financial management aspects of kind of what we'll be talking about today. So I do encourage y'all, if you have questions, as the content is being delivered, you don't need to hold it till the end of the 2-hour session. Like Melanie mentioned, if you want to put it in the chat, if you want to use the raise your hand feature, I have multiple screens up, so I'll kind of be looking all around, but we have a couple folks from the UNC EFC who will be here to help monitor all those different ways of making sure that this is as interactive as possible. So again, I know this is a virtual training, which means that sometimes it's easy to kind of zone in and out, but I do encourage you to ask questions, kind of make it as interactive as you can so that you can get as much out of it as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, just a little bit of background. Melanie spoke a bit about the Environmental Finance Center Network, but just in case you're curious who the organizations are that make up that network. They're all listed here. Today you're hearing from the Environmental Finance Center at UNC-Chapel Hill, but we are just one of, I think, 10 total organizations that make up this network. We are, as Melanie mentioned, hosted by nonprofits as well as universities, and you can see based on just the names alone that we do have some geographic diversity. So being in North Carolina, we're obviously closer to Kentucky than some of these other groups, but depending on what your needs might be, there might be other environmental finance centers who can assist with some of your additional needs at your utility. And so who is the UNC EFC? We are this group of people plus a bunch of other people who weren't able to make it for this photo. But we are a group that sits within the School of Government at UNC. And our mission is to support fair, effective, and financially sustainable delivery of environmental programs. And we do that through a number of different projects. We do it through these sort of trainings for wastewater systems. We also do applied research. We do a lot of teaching and outreach outside of these trainings, so within the university and across different states. We do advising, we do technical assistance, and we do policy analysis. So if you see something here that stands out to you as something that might be valuable for your system, our contact information will be provided at the end, and we encourage you to reach out to us. We're always happy to assist utilities. All right, so here's what you should expect over these 2 days. Today, I have a lot of content, which if you've ever attended one of my trainings before, you know that that's pretty typical. So I will do my best to make sure that the content that I deliver is clear. If you find that you have questions, please ask them. I'm happy to, revisit something. We don't need to cover all the content if it makes more sense to make sure that something is clearly covered. So again, we're going to be focusing on financial management today. And the components of that are going to be just kind of basic environmental finance, going to talk about budgeting and pricing for full cost recovery, going to talk about assessing financial conditions, so looking at financial benchmarks for utilities, and then I'm just going to have a very brief introduction to rate setting, and then there will be some additional resources that I point to at the end in case you're interested in more information. All right, so we are going to start with a get to know you. So in the chat, I'm going to ask that you write your name, the town or organization that you represent, the position that you sit in, right, your job, the number of years you have in kind of the water wastewater sector, and then just as a fun one, your favorite summer vacation spot. And then I've added a bonus, which you don't have to do, but if you're looking for bonus points, you can take a stab at where you think that photo is taken. So I'll give y'all a couple minutes to do that. And Christy, I'm not sure if you saw the message that just came in from Mike. I'm not sure if that's something you could assist with.
Yeah, Mike, I'll message you directly about that.
Thank you. All right, we've got Ryan Reed from Kentucky Division of Water, Capacity Development Program, Gulf Shores, Alabama. That's a good one. All right, we've got a guest for Virginia Beach for the bonus. I appreciate the effort. I won't spoil it yet. Okay, we've got Veronica from United South and Eastern Tribes in Nashville, financial analyst. Okay. Favorite summer spot at San Diego. Wow, cool. Okay. Carnival cruise. Love it. Okay, Murray, Kentucky, Murray State University. Just staying home. That's great. That is a nice vacation. Sometimes the nicest vacation is just the one that requires the least amount of effort, which is staying home. So I totally get that. All right, I'll give y'all 1 or 2 more minutes. Um, and anyone else want to take a stab at where you think that photo was taken? No vacation time. What is that? I like that. That's very funny. All right, let's see. Charleston, South Carolina. Okay, cool. Beautiful. I love Charleston. Okay, well, y'all can keep inputting those just in the interest of time. I'll just keep moving forward. Melanie, do you want to throw out your favorite summer vacation spot?
Yeah, I like to go to Miami because that's where a lot of my family is. So,
Perfect. That's great. All right, Mount Sterling, Kentucky supervisor, Myrtle Beach. Okay, so I don't know if you were guessing that's where the photo was taken, but that is Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. That's where I grew up, and I worked in the water sports industry there for a while. And I found that a lot of folks from Kentucky really enjoyed coming to Myrtle Beach. So I thought maybe there would be a chance that some folks on this call might be able to recognize it. And kind of like Melanie, I have a lot of family there, so it's definitely one of my favorite spots to visit. And it's also just really convenient from where we are. So, anyways, I appreciate y'all sharing. It's nice to get to know you all a little bit better and learn a little bit more about kind of what you do and what your interests are, right? You can kind of learn a lot about people from where they like to spend their free time. All right, let's keep it rolling. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about financial management. We're really going to be zooming into all things utility finances. And the real focus of this training is trying to talk to folks and help them understand why finances matter. There's a lot of really important components of running a water utility, and obviously finances are just one component of that. But within this training, we're really trying to get the point across that financial management, focusing on finances is critical to kind of the holistic approach to managing your utility. And so today, these are kind of going to be the key things that I aim to cover today. As I mentioned, it's a lot of stuff. So I'm going to start off just by reviewing the basics of water and wastewater system finances. I'm going to talk about the importance of setting a realistic revenue requirement and also pricing your wastewater services for full cost recovery. We're going to talk through some key performance benchmarks that might be useful for your utility that we use whenever we're doing financial health assessments of utilities. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about rate setting philosophies and some of the considerations that utilities often have whenever they're designing their rate structures, right? So what your rate setting objectives might be and how those influence how you approach your rates. So that's just kind of basic overview of what we'll be covering today. So to start, I'm going to provide you information that you're probably already aware of since y'all work at utilities. But wastewater systems, water and wastewater systems can serve multiple purposes. There's the environmental health side, right? There's this idea that we need to be providing our services that are protecting the environment as well as public health, right? We need to make sure that we're meeting regulatory requirements associated with the services that we provide, but also that we're protecting our water resources for recreation, for fishing, for swimming, for water supply, whatever it may be. Second, wastewater systems reflect a public service. The idea that we're providing the community with services that they can afford and that are also, high quality, right? We're providing them with services that are basic services for human life. And then third, it's the public enterprise. This is really kind of the focus of the financial management side of things, but approaching the system's finances as if it's a business, right? So thinking sustainably, thinking long-term, thinking about how to approach utility finance by borrowing a little bit from kind of traditional business practices. And what we found is that really to serve all of these purposes, water, wastewater utilities really need to focus on that sustainable finance. In order to protect public health and to protect the environment, to provide that public service and to operate as a public enterprise, utilities need to think about how they're financed both today and into the future. And our slogan at the UNC-EFC is how you pay for it matters. And we think that, that's really important for water and wastewater utilities and really all environmental services. All right, so we've got the first of our polls. So I'm going to have a series of polls throughout the course of today and tomorrow that we're going to ask y'all to respond to. And as Melanie mentioned, responses to these polls are part of getting those CEUs. So make sure that you respond to these polls. And these will just pop up on your screen. I'm going to launch this one right now. Okay, I'm going to give you like 30 more seconds. Make sure you get those votes in. Right now, capital needs is in the lead. So if you feel strongly for something else, make sure you get that in. All right. Give you like 10 more seconds. If you haven't voted, now's your time. All right. There we go. We got one more vote. Okay. Gonna close this one and share the results. All right. So hopefully y'all can see the results up here on your screen on the kind of GoToWebinar screen. So what we can see is that the vast majority of folks are most concerned about their capital needs. We got a few folks where the revenues don't cover their expenses, a couple folks that are unable to make their debt and interest payments, some concerns about customer bills, and then of course a few folks who aren't actually from a utility. So this isn't necessarily applicable to them. I will say that we're going to talk about a lot of this today. Because this is a 2-hour session, we won't be able to get into a ton of detail, but these are the kind of questions that we're constantly trying to answer at the UNC-EFC. So if you find that I've touched on something today that you want more information on, if you just are interested in a certain topic, you're more than welcome to reach out to us and we can make sure that we fill in any gaps that you have. All right, so now we're going to dive into the basics of utility finance. This is where we're going to kind of walk through the elements of utility financial management, what it means to be an enterprise fund, talk a little bit about financial policies and their role in utility sustainability. I'm going to talk about the types of costs that you might encounter at a utility if you're working in the financial space and the types of revenues. So first, if you're thinking about financial management broadly, the elements of financial management, I tried to capture them in as few components as I could, but know that each of these are pretty involved and this can be a kind of a cyclical process. So the first part is understanding your system and its finances. So first, understand your system. That's not just from a financial aspect. That might be, the actual assets that you have, the condition that they're in, kind of the prioritization, the criticality of those assets, because that all plays into your capital needs, that plays into your capital improvement planning, it plays into essentially, how you're going to budget to sustain your system into the future. But we also, recognize that you need to understand the financial component, both those capital needs as well as the day-to-day needs. So making sure that you have an understanding of what are the system's revenues, what are the system's costs, and what are those going to look like in the future. We recognize that a lot of things change, and to understand your system and its finances, you need to ask questions. So a big component of financial management is knowing what questions to ask and making sure that you're asking them, again, so that you can fully understand your system and its finances. And then based on those questions, based on your understanding, The idea being that you're making informed decisions, right? You have the information that you need, you understand your system, you've asked the appropriate questions, and based on that, you can make those informed decisions. I'll add that this is a constant process. The idea that you understand your system today, you've asked the appropriate questions today, does not necessarily mean that the information that you've gathered is going to be appropriate into the future. Things change. And so this is an ongoing process, but if you can kind of capture these key elements, you can have a pretty good understanding of where your system is and what you need to do to sustain it. So when we talk about understanding the system's finances, you can kind of split that into two broad categories. So understanding the costs and the revenues. And some of the key questions you might want to ask if you want to understand the costs associated with your system is first, what are those day-to-day costs, right? What are the operations and maintenance costs associated with our system today? What are our capital needs? What projects do we absolutely need to get done? When do we need to get them done? And how much is it going to cost? And then how do we expect our costs to change? So if we have a project that we know we want to do in 3 to 5 years, how do we expect costs to change? And right now is kind of an interesting time to talk about costs changing because obviously we've had pretty rampant inflation in the past few years. I know that whenever projects go out to bid, they have often come back a bit higher than people expect, just because there was a significant demand for contractors. So we do expect our costs to change over time. And sometimes it's hard to predict, but there are indexes that you can use, and I'm happy to point y'all to resources on that if you're interested. Then on the other side of the equation, there's your revenues, right? So if you want to understand the system's revenues, you first need to know who your customers are, right? Do you have a lot of commercial customers? Do you have a couple industrial customers that use a lot or produce a lot of wastewater? Do you have a mostly residential population? What does your customer base look like? Can your customers afford your rates? What's kind of the demographic makeup of your customers? Do you have mostly kind of middle income customers? Do you have kind of a large proportion of low income and then some high income customers? What do your customers look like? And if you were to raise your rates, would your customers be able to afford it? And then finally, sort of like we said with the costs, how do you expect your revenues to change? Are you located in a growing area? Do you expect that going forward, you're actually going to have more revenue because you've got development coming in, because you've got a new industry that's supposed to move in? Or is it the inverse, right? Do you have an area that's kind of shrinking in population, or people are using less water and thus, sending less wastewater to the wastewater treatment plant? How do you expect your revenues to change? These are kind of the key questions that we recommend that utility folks ask to understand their system. And again, like I mentioned before, things change. So these questions that you ask, the questions may stay the same, but the answers may change. So just understanding that financial management is an ongoing process. It isn't something that you do once and you just set aside and you say like, we did it, we've managed our system. It is something that we recommend is done on a cyclical basis, depending on kind of what your utility can do, right? What's sustainable for your utility? Is it addressing it every 6 months? Is it addressing it annually? That's really for y'all to decide based on the capacity that you have at your system. And so I mentioned before that wastewater utilities, water and wastewater utilities are enterprise funds. And essentially what this means is that we've got monopolies, right? I believe in Kentucky, water and wastewater utilities are regulated by the PSC. But the idea is that we've created these kind of one-stop shops for wastewater treatment within our communities. And the idea behind that is really that it's a hugely capital-intensive industry. I mean, it costs a lot of money to build the infrastructure associated with treating wastewater. And so it's not like it's more competitive by having two lines running side by side from two different entities. And the idea there is that because we are an enterprise fund, the revenues that we collect should reflect the cost that we're paying to provide that service, right? It's that business model of basically cost of service. How much does it cost to provide that service? And can we make sure that our revenues match those costs? It's typically separated from other funds. So an enterprise fund is not part of the general fund. It's a separate fund that's just associated with whatever utility or service we're talking about. We charge fees or rates for those services. And then the idea is that it's self-sufficient. Again, the revenues collected reflect the costs associated with providing that service. So we don't have to transfer funds. The funds that are associated with that enterprise fund are reflective of the funds that we need to run the system. Financial policies These are basically guidelines for an organization's financial, operational, and strategic decision making. So these would be policies that your utility might incorporate if you wanted to sort of meet certain standards, right? So you could enact policies if there was something that you really wanted to do at your utility. Maybe you wanted to have a certain amount of cash for emergencies, right? You could want to have cash on hand for your reserves. There are a number of different financial policies that you could enact, but it's the idea that we're basically doing some sort of ordinance. We're putting forth some sort of actual formal policy of how we want to manage our system. And the idea here is that by putting something in writing, it's you're more committed to it, right? And so there's a greater likelihood of kind of having that long-term financial sustainability. And because it is an enterprise fund, water and wastewater utilities, what we typically say is that your utility should not be subsidizing the tax base or vice versa. So it's like what I talked about before. It's that self-sufficiency. The utility should be able to sustain itself. And because it should only be reflective of the cost of running that utility, there shouldn't be transfers to the general fund or vice versa. But what we do know is that oftentimes across local governments, staff time is shared, right? So the public works director, for example, might do something stormwater related that falls within the general fund and might also do water wastewater work. And so it is appropriate in those circumstances to bill for time accordingly across, the general fund and that enterprise fund, but that's very different than a transfer because that's actually reflective of their time. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the types of costs that you might encounter. First, your operating costs. These are the ones that are you're probably most familiar with. These are just the ones that you need to run the system day in and day out, also known as O&M or operations and maintenance. And whenever we're recommending kind of assessing the future of these costs, what we typically recommend is the easiest way to project future costs is to look at previous years. Basically kind of understanding what the costs have been over time at your system and using that as an ability to project changes. So if your costs increased 3% over the last 3 years, then that might be a good baseline for predicting how your costs might change in the future. It's also a good opportunity to look at line by line where you're spending money at your utility and identify if there might be opportunities for places to save money. Maybe it's energy efficiency, right? Maybe you're using a lot of energy within your wastewater treatment plant and there's opportunities to identify areas where you could save money if you're doing a new capital project going forward. We also recommend that with your operating costs, you look to the future, right? Like I mentioned before, think about how these might change going forward. And then also don't forget the indirect costs of running the system. So any sort of shared management costs or shared facility costs, things that might be embedded in some of the other things whenever you look at your balance sheet, but might be, important for your system. The second type of cost is capital costs. And this one is, as the poll suggested, usually quite daunting for folks. These can be really large numbers. These needs can be quite big. But these are the rehabilitation and replacement costs for existing infrastructure or to build new infrastructure. And assessing capital costs can be tricky for all the reasons I mentioned previously, things like inflation. It could be going out to bid and finding that the bids that come back are higher than you anticipated. But what we often recommend is starting with asset management. Do you understand the system as it exists now? If so, that can help the utility prioritize projects going forward, identify the projects that absolutely need to be done now versus those that can be pushed off a bit into the future, and then better align your capital resources to align with those capital needs. And then the final cost is debt service. So utilities, often will take out loans or bonds to build capital projects. And so those debt service payments usually come annually in the form of principal and interest payments. And so those are costs that will show up on your balance sheet, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is essentially just what you owe on those loans and bonds, for that money that you borrowed for the capital project that you have to pay back. On the revenue side, you've got the system income. So this is the money that you're getting from your rates. If you have any sort of tap fees, system development charges, any grants that came in, any penalties or fees that you might charge if someone, for late payment or whatever. These are kind of the system incomes. These are the things that you're probably very familiar with. And just to be clear, again, as I mentioned before, in a pure enterprise fund fashion, this isn't taxes unless you have, explicit permission based on the governance structure of the utility or, state statutes, what have you. And then you also do have debt, right? So you've got your debt service payments, which are costs, but the actual money coming in, the borrowed money, is a revenue. You just have to pay it back. And so just a question for y'all. Again, this is another poll, and I'll give y'all about, like I did before, about 60 to 90 seconds to respond. But the question here is, does your utility currently have any debt? All right, I'll give you like 15 more seconds. Get in your vote if you haven't already done it. All right, I'm gonna close the poll and share the results. Okay, hopefully y'all can see the results here. So actually quite a few folks are currently paying back at least one loan or bond. We've got someone who's considering taking on debt, and then a couple folks who either weren't sure or the question wasn't applicable to them. So it seems like based on the folks that are in the room, y'all are probably pretty familiar with debt service payments, with the responsibility, of being able to generate revenues that are sufficient to pay back that debt service. For the folks that are considering taking on debt, at least at this point in history, there's a considerable amount of money going through the state revolving loan funds, some of which, is offered in the form of principal forgiveness, but some of which is low interest loans. So we are seeing that more and more utilities have experience taking on loans, whether it be a USDA loan or one of those state revolving fund loans. And those are long-term financial commitments, right? So it's something important to keep in mind as you're thinking about the financial sustainability of the system. Okay, so let's hop on to the next slide. All right, so reserve funds. We talked about costs, we talked about revenues. Now let's talk about the savings accounts, right? This reserve funds. So there are many different types of reserve funds. I've only listed a couple of the ones that are available here on this slide. So you've got a capital reserve fund. So this would be funds that would be set aside specifically for infrastructure rehabilitation and replacement. You could have a repair fund. So let's say that you know that you have kind of ongoing maintenance needs. You've got regular repairs coming up and you want to have a pot of funds set aside dedicated to that. You could create a reserve fund associated with repairs. Emergency funds, these are somewhat common, just having essentially money set aside in case something comes up, right? If something comes up, then you've got a pot of funds that you can rely on. And then a rainy day fund. So rainy day, because under rainy conditions, people use less water, but just for those unexpected revenue shortfalls. If there's a time where something comes up, COVID kind of being the obvious example, right? There are moratoriums on shutoffs, just unexpected revenue shortfalls, conditions where people might not be able to pay their bills or something might prevent you from actually providing the service. That's basically the objective of a rainy day fund. All right, so another poll question for y'all. Does your utility currently have a reserve fund? All right, I'm launching it now. Give y'all about another minute. All right, I'll give you about 15 more seconds. So if you haven't voted, make sure to get your vote in now. Okay, close the poll and share the results. So you can see that we've got a few folks who have reserve funds, one that's considering a reserve fund, one that doesn't have a reserve fund, or are they considering one, and then again, a couple that are not applicable or are unsure. Having a reserve fund is not necessarily something that a utility has to do. There could just be money that sits in the fund balance that essentially covers all of the things that I talked about before. Reserve funds can be restricted or unrestricted, so there are different ways of approaching it from the utility perspective. So this is pretty much reflective of, I think, what I've seen in the past. It's not necessarily something that everyone does, but it is a popular way of setting aside funds specifically for like emergencies or capital improvements. Okay. So the question that we often get at the UNC-EOC whenever folks are considering starting reserve funds is how much money should we have in our reserve fund? And we always give kind of the answer that no one likes, which is that it depends. We recommend having money in there for your debt service payments for sure, but beyond that, it's really up to the utility. And so it's up to the utility to understand, where do you fall, right? Do you want to set aside enough money to pay for your most expensive piece of equipment? Being kind of maybe on the lower end, covering your costs if you had no revenue for 2 months, covering the projects in your capital improvement plan. These are kind of like the risk questions that are typically very specific to the utility itself. So what risks is your utility subject to, and what is the general appetite for risk? And that's typically what we recommend whenever utilities are thinking about reserve funds, is just have that conversation, understand what the priorities are, and make sure that the money that you're setting aside is reflective of those priorities and the relative risk of the utility itself. So I talked about system costs, I talked about revenues, and I talked about reserve funds, right? Those kind of savings accounts. This diagram is really helpful for thinking about the way that money can flow across those three different categories. So on the left-hand side, we've got system income. And you can see that system income is very flexible, right? It can cover your operating costs, it can go towards current capital projects, it can pay for debt service payments, and it can go into your reserve funds. So your system income, in terms of revenues that you have, it's very flexible in what it can address. In contrast, debt can really just go towards those current capital projects. You're borrowing money for something that has a useful life, right? Let's say 40 years, and you're going to pay back whatever amount that you've borrowed over the course of that useful life. And it's kind of the opposite of using system income for your capital projects, which is typically called pay as you go, and instead basically taking the pay as you use approach. So you're paying back the cost of that asset over the life of that asset. As it's being used, it's being paid back. Your reserve fund is also pretty flexible. So it's again that kind of savings account. It could go towards current capital projects. It could go towards paying those debt service payments. We've got this dotted line towards operating costs. We typically, we don't recommend using your reserve fund to cover your operating costs, but in the times of revenue shortfalls, depending on how you've set up your reserve fund, it could be used for those purposes as well. All right, so just in summary of this first section, financial management is an ongoing process, so it's something that needs to be continuously reevaluated. Utilities are often set up as enterprise funds, meaning that they should be setting rates and fees to cover the costs of providing service. It should be that business-like mentality. And then utility staff should consider the connection between system costs, revenues, and reserve funds when managing finances. So when you're thinking about your revenues, your costs, and your reserves, again, think about how they're connected, how money can be used for what, and making sure that you've got everything in balance so that you can cover your needs. All right, so before I move on to budgeting, I don't see anything in the chat, but again, if y'all have questions, you're welcome to raise your hand or put them in the chat, and I'm happy to respond to questions. We'll have kind of these section breaks at the end of each section, so I'm happy to, pause and answer questions as needed. Okay, so just a note that Kentucky systems are divided between municipal and PSC regulated systems. Okay, so yes, that's very helpful, thank you. So that slide where I said that they're self-regulated or PSC regulated, so it seems like it is a mix of the two. And in North Carolina, our local government utilities are not regulated by the Utilities Commission, but just our private utilities are, which is really just a handful of water and wastewater utilities here. So that's really helpful. And I know that if you are regulated by the PSC, that does play into the equation of, how you might approach changing your rates, right? Because there are additional costs associated with changing your rates because you have to actually go in front of the PSC and kind of, put together a rate case. So that's very helpful. Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that feedback. All right, so I'll just keep moving. If y'all have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to kind of glance over and cover those questions as I can. So over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to be talking very briefly about budgeting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, primarily because we are going to dive into the other side of the equation, which are the financial statements. So not the forward-looking, but the past-looking side of kind of your balance sheet. So again, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, but we'll try to tie in some of what we talked about before with some of the future planning, the projecting of system costs, revenues, and reserve funds. So budgets, and I'll pause and say I took an entire semester long course on budgeting, and so I'm going to try to sum this up in like 10 minutes, which is obviously quite difficult. But in general, budgets accomplish multiple objectives. They're forward-looking policy documents, so they are reflective of the goals of the local government, the utility. They're designed to be somewhat forward-looking and somewhat planning-oriented. They appropriate funds. So the budget basically says how much each department, each utility, what their revenues are going to look like over the course of the year. Many budgets will sometimes measure financial or operational performance. So they'll actually evaluate, whatever the kind of key performance indicators that they're interested in, they'll evaluate that within the budget itself. The budget will set rates and fees. That could be for water and wastewater. It could be for other services that are provided by the local government. And then budgets also serve a public education and communication role. So it's again that kind of like policy-oriented nature of the document itself. Maybe it's an opportunity to educate the public on what the utility does, right? Who the staff are, the miles of pipe, whatever the kind of key components or communication elements that are important for your community to know about your system. So the process of budgets and budgeting, budgets are typically done on an annual basis, so it provides that yearly plan. But budgets will sometimes include like a capital improvement plan, or we'll talk about plans further out into the future. So there is that future planning aspect of budgets themselves. Budgets determine the priorities for the utility or for the local government. They outline where the money's going to go. Again, if you're thinking about capital projects, the budget is going to allocate funds to certain capital projects, and that's going to be indicative of the priorities. And then finally, after this kind of iterative process, the board will review and approve the budget, and then that's what is essentially used over the course of the following year. And so when we're thinking about budgets as a policy document and trying to connect them to utility financial management, the kind of key component of that is the revenue requirement. And I mentioned this in an earlier slide, but this is the science part of the rate-making process. So it's essentially setting the bar for how much you need to operate a financially sustainable utility. Again, we want to make sure that our revenues are adequate to cover the costs of the system. So we need to understand how much it costs to run the system. And based on those costs, how much revenue do we need to bring in to meet those day-to-day costs and also plan for the future? That being kind of the revenue requirement associated with the utility in the budget. And the consequences of not understanding that revenue requirement can be quite significant. It could result in the utility not being financially sustainable. It could mean that the utility collects too much. It could mean that the utility collects too little, or it could send the wrong message to your customers. Again, if you're thinking about the communication and public outreach components of the budget, of the budgeting process, making sure that you understand the financial management of the system is an important PR and kind of communication component of this whole process. So when we're talking about budgeting for the full cost, there's a lot involved in the full cost, and that's more or less the takeaway of this slide. The operations and maintenance expenditures are the ones that people tend to focus on, and they are they're the day-to-day needs. They're the things that are probably most present. But there also needs to be money set aside for capital improvements. If there's any sort of principal and interest payments that are being made now, there needs to be money set aside to cover those principal and interest payments. Contingencies for emergencies. The financial auditing process that occurs at the end of the year, there needs to be costs set aside for those accounting costs, any sort of contracts, indirect costs, retirement costs of pensions, any sort of related services. So maybe, on the drinking water side, there's a source water protection program. That could be something that money needs to be set aside for. And then the opportunity costs associated with any sort of project. And an important thing that we try to remind folks whenever we give these trainings is that water and wastewater is a very capital intensive industry. It takes a lot to provide water and wastewater services because there is so much, actual infrastructure involved with providing that service. And so this is a pretty dated slide, but it essentially just kind of gives you the breakdown of dollar of invested capital per $1 generated revenue for a few different industries. And what you can see is that, water wastewater services are far more expensive than any of the other industries that were included in this research. And so when utilities are thinking about trying to meet their revenue requirements, some of the tips that we give are first to remember that your water use or wastewater use and the associated revenue varies from year to year. The information from last year is not necessarily going to be indicative of this year. This year is not necessarily going to be indicative of next year, especially if you think about like patterns in rainfall. If you think about the fact that, maybe people are coming and going, you've got growth, you've got decline. So whenever we're kind of talking about projecting some of the usage, right, the consumption component of your revenues, we often recommend, looking at a larger chunk of time and trying to kind of average out some of the different things that might occur year to year. If you're looking to predict future costs, talking to your suppliers can help within, especially if they're within the private industry, they might have some understanding. They might be doing those projections themselves and might be willing to share how they anticipate the market changing and costs changing. And then again, just remember that those reserve funds exist and you can set aside funds for capital improvements. You can use those reserve funds to kind of create that nest egg for emergencies. There's a lot of different opportunities with those reserve funds. And we always recommend using several past years to project. I just mentioned that. Budgeting based on necessary expenditures, and then also considering the life cycle cost and criticality of your assets. So this again goes back to asset management and asset management plans, but thinking about the total cost of the asset over its life, as well as how important it is, right? What is the risk if that asset fails, and what is the probability that it's going to fail? And using that as kind of a planning requirement for where you're setting aside your funds. And again, just a couple more recommendations. We recommend thinking about the different costs associated with running the utility as buckets, right? So you've got these different buckets of costs, not just all of the costs associated with running the utility. And then we recommend checking, how you budgeted for each of these individual buckets relative to how much you're actually spending. Consider the timing of your spending and making sure that you're budgeting accordingly. If you've got, let's say, a lot of tourists during the summer, you may find that, your costs and revenues are much higher during the summer and they're much lower throughout the course of the year. So just making sure you understand your customer base and when your revenues come in and budgeting according to that. And then again, just looking at all your costs, making sure that you understand all the costs associated with running the system, so that you can budget accordingly. And so in summary, like I said, this was going to be a short section on budgeting. Budgets are policy documents that serve a number of purposes, including setting rates and fees and projecting costs and revenues. To meet the revenue requirements, utility staff need to budget for the full cost of running the system. And while historical data is helpful to project future costs and revenues, it's always important to remember that things change. The more information you can pull into however you're projecting what your costs are going to be, the better those projections will be. But again, things always change. So making sure you're using those reserve funds, you're using that money that you're setting aside to allow you to kind of smooth out any bumps in the road. All right, so before I move on to, we started with budgets, which are forward-looking. Before I move on to financial statements, which look back to the past, I'll again pause and just make sure that there's no questions from anyone, nothing that was unclear that anyone wanted a little bit of follow-up on. I don't see anything in the chat. Okay. Well, again, if you have questions, comments, put them in the chat. I am monitoring it, and I'm happy to address those as they come in. All right, so as I mentioned, we're kind of shifting from the policy document, which is the budget, to that third-party evaluation, the audit at the end of the year, right? You bring in this third party, they look at the system's finances, and they give you this document that basically presents the operating revenues, the expenditures, everything that you need to know about the system from a third-party perspective. So first, just a quick overview of financial statements. Many of you may be familiar with financial statements already, so this will just be a review. But when you look at a financial statements that come in at the end of the year are often many pages long, right? So you'll have a letter from the auditor, from the accountant on the front, and then you'll have information about the governmental funds, and then you'll have some information about the enterprise funds, and then you'll have the notes at the end. And so there's a lot of information in there, and sometimes it can be a little bit daunting to figure out how to navigate it. So the idea with these first few slides are just to introduce you to kind of the different pages that might be relevant if you were to look at your utilities financial statements. So just a quick overview. I've already thrown out the term financial statement or audit a few times. Again, this is that third-party evaluation that occurs at the end of the fiscal year that is essentially just looking at the finances from an outsider's perspective and evaluation of where the system stands. And they only reflect that fiscal year. So this is typically done on an annual basis. It's produced, it's often publicly available. Whenever we're doing technical assistance with utilities, we'll often look at these financial statements. They help us understand the financial health of the system. And for the purposes of this training, we're really just focused on, again, the enterprise funds or the proprietary funds, and those are separated out within these financial statements, within these audits, so that we can really zoom in on just the utility itself. If you wanted to look at the general fund, if you're curious about the general fund, those statements are in there as well. But for the purposes of this training, we're just focused on that enterprise fund. All right, so the first kind of page you might encounter would be the statement of net position. And so the statement of net position tells you what the assets and liabilities of the wastewater or water system are on the day that the financial statements were prepared. So we often say this is just a snapshot, right? It just depends on the data from the day that the financial statements were prepared, because it's your assets and liabilities, which they shift, right? They shift over time. It's going to be your current assets, things like unrestricted cash, as well as your current liabilities. And so we do use these whenever we're evaluating the financial health of a system, but we always kind of approach this one a little bit differently than some of the others because it is just that snapshot of whenever these financial statements were prepared. The next page that you might encounter is the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position. And this page is going to be really important because it's going to tell you the annual operating and non-operating revenues and expenses for the system. And you'll also find depreciation, any sort of debt service or amortization, expenses might be found here. And then if there were transfers that were occurring to and from the general fund, it would also be found on this sheet. So again, whenever we're looking at the financial health of a system, this is a page that we often spend a lot of time on evaluating, especially if we're looking at multiple years of data. The next page you might encounter is the statement of cash flows. This is going to show you the money in and out of the system. It's the flow of cash, as the page title implies. And this is where you'll find your debt, principal, and interest payments. So if you're interested to see how much your utility is spending on principal and interest every year, if you're thinking of taking on a new loan and you want to understand, what is this going to be in total for our principal and interest payments, this is a great place to start because it's going to tell you how much you spent over the past year. And then you're going to encounter those notes. And I mentioned this whenever I was kind of talking about the document as a whole. The notes can be short, they can be long. It really just depends. But this is where you'll find the explanations where needed to the financial statements. So it is exactly as the name implies. It's the notes for all of the pages that I mentioned previously. And typically within the notes, you'll also find detailed information on your capital assets. So this is where you'll find the total depreciable capital assets for the utility, as well as the total accumulated depreciation. So how much of those capital assets have already depreciated. So again, can be long, can be short, but there's still important information that can be found in these notes. All right, so I'm going to launch another poll. This one is, does your utility have yearly audited financial statements? All right, launching it now. And I'll give you about a minute. All right, I'll give you like 10 more seconds. So if you haven't voted, get your vote in. Okay, closing the poll. All right, so we've got a lot of people who have their utility get audited financials every year, and they read them every year, which is excellent. So kudos for that. Again, this is probably going to be in large part review for you, but hopefully we'll talk about some important financial indicators that might be useful as you read these going forward. We do find often that some utilities do not have audited financial statements. Depending on the state, sometimes these are required for certain types of funds, right, to apply for a grant or for a loan. And so we recommend, trying to consider going forward how you might be able to work this in to the utilities costs. I know that in many states, finding an auditor can be challenging. And so again, if this is something that your utility would be interested in trying to put forth going forward and you need recommendations, you're always welcome to reach out to us or to reach out to folks at the state. I'm sure they'd be happy to provide you some context and feedback on that. All right, so let's keep rolling here. Financial benchmarks. So the fun part of this section is that we get to do a little bit of math. Because this is a virtual training, for the traditional in-person trainings, we often give people a handout and ask them to actually do the math. Because this is a virtual training, you'll kind of be doing the math yourself if you want to. But if you don't want to, I won't, go around the room and ask people to answer questions. So you have a little bit more flexibility on that front. I know some people don't really love math. I really like math, and I think that this is pretty easy math to understand. So hopefully it'll be pretty accessible for everyone here today. All right, so what are financial benchmarks? These often come up in budgets, and I talked about in the budgeting portion of this how budgets might try to communicate key performance indicators, how the government is doing in some sort of measure of success. And so within the utility context, it's more or less the same thing. These are quantifiable measures of performance. They're things that we can measure, right? There are a lot of things that are really challenging to measure. You can do surveys, right, of customer service to see how your customers are satisfied with the system, but it's much harder to measure. The financial benchmarks are things that you might find in your financial audits and thus are measurable and that are also available. And second, they should be things that people care about. There are a lot of things that we can measure that people maybe don't care about. Depending on if there's a couple people that care, it might be worth measuring. But again, it's just a function of time. So if you can figure out what people care about and what can be measured, that basically those are the things that you should be shooting for from a financial benchmarking perspective. Financial benchmarks allow you to measure progress. So you can assess the operational performance based on today. If you wanted to go back in time and look at information from 5 years ago and compare, you could do that. You could also take the information from today and say, these are our numbers as of today. This is our goal for the future, and then figure out a path to connect those dots. So financial benchmarks provide a lot of opportunity to assess the status quo, but also to figure out how, if you want to change things, you can change things going forward, and maybe set a financial policy, right? Maybe there's some sort of financial benchmark that is really, really important to your utility that you want to make sure that you hit. And so you can enact some sort of financial policy to allow you to get there. Additionally, financial benchmarks often matter if you're looking to go to the private market to get a loan. So let's say you want to get a loan from a local lender. Maybe you want to go to the bond market and try to get a loan. The folks that are evaluating those loans or bonds are often going to be looking at these financial benchmarks. These are going to be the things that they care about, that they can measure, that they're using whenever they're evaluating what they're investing in, right? Because you've got the utility who's requesting funds, the borrower, and then you've got the entity that has the funds, the lender. And so the lender is assessing who they're borrowing or who they're giving their money to and whether or not that entity can pay them back. And so oftentimes these financial benchmarks are an easy way for them to evaluate, this is what the system looks like today, this is the likelihood that they'll be able to pay us back, and this is how we're going to structure that loan or bond based on that information. So again, there's a lot of different ways that this information can be used. It can be used by external parties, folks outside the utility. It can be used by the utility itself. It might be something that your board or your elected officials are interested in because it's, again, just like kind of quick, easy stuff to measure. There are a lot of different folks that might be interested in this, and thus it's really valuable. So I am going to spend a bit of time here today just to make sure that we understand these financial benchmarks and the potential value to your utility. So I already kind of talked about why you should care about them, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. But again, it gives you a holistic picture of your utility performance and needs. It'll quickly allow you to identify if there's any sort of deficits in the utility's finances, things that you need to address immediately. It'll also identify areas where you're doing really well. Maybe you have a lot of cash on hand, so you have that money set aside for emergencies. You've got that rainy day fund, just embedded in that fund balance. It'll allow you to set future goals and understand growth. It can help you inform your capital planning. It can help you understand affordability. And then it also provides you with an understanding of the financing options that might be available to you, again, for kind of the reasons that I mentioned before. Or if you're looking to get a state revolving fund loan, there might be certain requirements for debt service coverage within those loan agreements. And so again, this might provide you with an opportunity to understand your eligibility for that kind of stuff, or changes that you might have to make if you wanted to take on that loan. So these are going to be on the right-hand side in red are the key financial benchmarks that I'm going to be covering today. So you've got your operating ratio, asset depreciation, debt service coverage ratio, days cash on hand, and then your quick ratio or your current ratio. Those terms are kind of used interchangeably. And I'll talk about each of these individually on individual slides. But these are kind of the key questions that we're aiming to answer whenever we calculate these financial benchmarks. So the operating ratio is basically telling us if the system is self-sufficient. Again, going back to the enterprise fund, revenues and costs, self-sufficiency, that's what the operating ratio really captures. Your asset depreciation is telling you how much your utility's expected life has already run out. I'll go into more detail on this and help you understand at least what we typically see as the approach to asset depreciation within those financial statements. Your debt service coverage ratio will tell you if you're able to cover your debt service payments after you're paying your day-to-day operational expenditures, right? Do you have enough money left over after you pay O&M to pay your debt service? Your days cash on hand will tell you how long you can continue to operate if all of your customers stopped paying your bills. Again, I'll talk about all of these a little bit more. And then your current ratio, your quick ratio, tells you if your system can meet its short-term obligations. So again, if on the day that the statements were prepared, if all the folks that, all your liabilities came forward and said, hey, we need our money back, could you give it back with your current assets? All right, so again, as I go through these, if you have questions, please just put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'm happy to answer them. This is really, I think, helpful stuff as if you're thinking about utility financial management. It provides you the opportunity to understand where your utility is today and gives you something to shoot for whenever you're setting rates in the future. So if you have questions, please take the time to type out those questions and I'll happily answer them. All right, so your operating ratio. I mentioned before that this is the measure of self-sufficiency. So this is essentially the revenue that you get from your daily operations divided by your expenditures or expenses that you need to keep the system running. And so you can see here on each of these slides, we're going to have an equation. On top, you can see is operating revenues, and it's divided by your operating expenses. And these operating expenses can include or exclude depreciation. We usually calculate both whenever we're doing technical assistance for utilities. The idea that we do both is because we typically recommend including depreciation in your operating ratio because it gives you some understanding of the money that you might need to be setting aside to cover your future capital costs, right? If you're setting aside money to cover your future capital costs, then you're kind of putting yourself in a good position. Oftentimes utilities are just interested in seeing, okay, yes, with depreciation, but how are we doing day to day without that depreciation, without that capital expense? And so we often calculate both. And what we typically recommend is a value greater than 1, right? We want to make sure that the number on this numerator, the revenues, is greater than the number on the denominator, the expenses. Because that tells us that our system is self-sufficient. We brought in enough money to cover our day-to-day expenditures or our day-to-day expenditures and future needs. And so operating revenues, it's going to be the system income that I talked about before. It's going to be the income from your rates, from late fees, penalties, connection fees, tap fees, etc. And then your operating expenses are going to be all of those O&M costs. It's going to be the supplies, it's going to be salary and benefits, any overtime, taxes, insurance, depreciation, the utility costs, right? The energy bill associated with running the utility. What is not included in your operating expenses are your debt service payments or your reserves. These are not day-to-day costs associated with running the system. Those are more so associated with kind of capital improvements or kind of long-term system planning. So those are not included in your operating expenditures. I already kind of talked about depreciation, but I did want to take a second to take a step back and make sure that it's very, very clear what I mean by depreciation. And depreciation is essentially, it's an accounting solution for a physical problem, which is basically the idea that as our infrastructure ages, it loses value. That's more or less kind of the premise behind it. And so typically every year, that depreciation that shows up in the financial statements is the cost associated with your infrastructure wearing out, and it's some percentage of its value. And what you can see on the right is essentially infrastructure that has aged, right? And so in theory, if we have this cost associated with the loss of value of this infrastructure year over year, again, it's some amount of money that we might be setting aside for capital improvements in the future. And so what is depreciation? This is kind of a three-part definition. It's that loss of value over time of an asset that's not restored by current maintenance. You could maintain an asset extremely well. It will still depreciate over time. There's still a useful life associated with an asset. It is an economic fact for any water or wastewater system because it is an accounting approach. And it is the value lost from both declining physical factors and functional or non-physical factors. So just being obsolete. So you could think about something associated with your system that maybe was used 50 years ago, but would no longer be used today. It's just obsolete. And thus it has lost value as a result of that. The most common approach to depreciation that we see at the UNC-EFC whenever we look at financial statements is what's called straight line depreciation. And it's basically the idea that a asset has a purchase price, it has a useful life, and then based on that, we can calculate, an annual depreciation expense that is a function of its purchase price and useful life. And so the easy example here is, let's say you have a $10,000 hydrodynamic tank. It has a useful life of 10 years. Using straight line depreciation, we literally just take $10,000 divided by 10 years, and that's our annual depreciation expense. And so essentially our depreciation expense associated with this tank on our financial statements would be $1,000 a year. That's straight line depreciation. A lot of folks recognize the fact that this is not reflective of how value is actually lost from any sort of asset, right? If you maintain an asset really well, it may extend past its useful life. It may be that it never reaches its useful life, even if you maintain it well. There's a lot of different factors involved with the life of an asset. But from an accounting perspective, because again, we're talking about financial statements here, this is typically the approach that we see. There are other approaches out there, but this is the one that we typically see because it's easy to calculate, right? It's just simple division, the purchase price, the useful life, and then you get that annual value. So whenever we're talking about operating ratio and depreciation, as I mentioned earlier, we recommend including depreciation in your operating ratio. We call it fully funding depreciation. That's when you include, the full depreciation cost in your operating ratio, It allows you to have saved money for replacement of assets when replacement is needed. And I will add that, the depreciation cost, this hydropneumatic tank, 10 years from now, the replacement of that asset probably won't be $10,000, right? It's probably going to cost more in 10 years because of inflation, because, maybe the materials associated with it are more expensive. There's a lot of different things that could play into the future cost. But at least you have set aside some amount of money to plan for future capital improvements. So we usually say that it's a great starting point. For utilities that have the opportunity to do asset management, to produce an asset management plan or do some sort of capital planning, that is typically a more holistic approach. But there's a lot more work involved with putting that information together. So we typically say, fully funding depreciation is a great starting point for utilities. And again, that's why we calculate it whenever we do these kind of financial benchmarks for utilities. All right, so we're moving into the math portion, just doing the operating ratio right here. So this is the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net assets for a town that is not actually called Mayberry, but it is a town that we've done technical assistance with in the past that we've just named Mayberry. And what you can see on here are a few things called out. You've got numbers 1, 2, and 3 here. Number 1 shows you your total operating revenues, 444,231. That's going to be an important number to write down. I'm going to do it. 231. And then you've got your total operating expenses, which is 511,448. And then you've got your depreciation value, which is 142,463. So again, we're thinking about operating ratio. So the important things for us to note are the operating revenues, operating expenses, and then that depreciation value. So that's why those are identified here. Okay, so we're going to do a quick calculation using the numbers from Mayberry. All right, so the operating revenues value, as we saw on the slide previously, is $444,231. The operating expenses value, excluding depreciation, is basically going to be that number 2 value, which was 511,448, minus the depreciation value, which was number 3, which is 142,463. So you can see here on the slide, we've got it set up to do the math. And that gives us an operating expenses value of $368,985. So just by glancing at this, you can probably tell that Mayberry is over 1, right? The numerator is bigger than the denominator. And whenever we exclude depreciation, the operating ratio for this utility is 1.2. So this is something that would usually say is pretty good, right? Their day-to-day expenditures are covered and then some. So they do have some money set aside for any sort of emergencies that might pop up, things that pop up that are just unexpected, or costs that exceed what they budgeted for. Now we're going to include depreciation. So again, the numerator is that same value, 444,231. We haven't changed anything on the revenue side, but this time, instead of excluding depreciation, we're just going to keep it in. So we're just going to use that 511,448 value, which is our operating expenses with depreciation. And again, what you can probably already see is that the number that comes out of this is going to be very different. And it's 0.87. So we can see that whenever we're including depreciation, Mayberry is currently not bringing in enough revenue to cover their day-to-day expenses, as well as setting aside kind of the full value of their depreciation expense. This would be something that if we were to follow up and do sort of a rate study or rate analysis with Mayberry, we would recommend maybe thinking about how they could change their rates to increase their revenues ever so slightly, so that they could try to cover more of that depreciation cost. All right, so another indicator that we often calculate whenever we do technical assistance with utilities is asset depreciation. And that's basically just going to show us in aggregate of all of your total capital assets that are depreciable, how much of them have already depreciated. And so what you can find typically in the notes is this gross plant and equipment. So that's going to be your total depreciable assets, and then an accumulated depreciation value. So basically the idea here is that if you have 2 of those tanks that I talked about before, and they're each 5 years old, right? So you've got a total gross plant and equipment, let's say that's all you have in your system, 2 of those tanks, that's going to be 10,000 plus 10,000 or $20,000. And let's say that each of them are 5 years old, right? So each year we're going to set aside $1,000 for each of those tanks. So that's going to be a total of 5,000 each if they're 5 years old. So what you'll essentially find is that they're about half depreciated, right? The useful life is about half gone from an accounting perspective of the assets that you have. Again, this is an accounting number, so it's not necessarily an actual representation of the physical life left of your assets. but it is a good way for us as an external party, if we're doing some sort of technical assistance, to evaluate if capital needs are really urgent, right? If we see that that value is really large, if it's getting close to 1, if the assets are almost totally depreciated, then we need to think about setting aside funds for capital improvements. We need to think about what funding and financing sources are out there so that we can make sure we can start getting some of those projects off the ground, with the recognition that it's going to take a while to have a lot of capital projects. So we need to start thinking about capital planning. So I won't go through the calculation for this one. Again, this is one that we use whenever we do technical assistance. I'm happy to provide more information on it if it's something that's interesting to folks, or follow up if you have questions at any point in time. All right, the next indicator we're going to talk about is the debt service coverage ratio. And so there's kind of several different parts to this debt service coverage ratio, but you can see down here is the equation. So again, we're using the operating revenues number minus our operating expenditures, excluding depreciation, over our principal and interest payments on long-term debt. So again, this is telling us after we've paid all of our day-to-day expenditures associated with the system, none of the depreciation costs, just the day-to-day costs, do we have enough money left over to pay our principal and interest payments? That's our ability to cover our debt service, right? That debt service coverage. And so whenever, from a utility perspective, you need to make sure that you're bringing in enough revenues to pay for those O&M costs and the principal and interest payments. It's a measure of the ability to pay the debt service with operating revenue. It's the operating revenue that's left over after you've covered those day-to-day expenditures. And this is a very common metric for lenders. I talked about previously that some of these financial benchmarks are going to be particularly important for third parties, for folks who are lending money. This one is very important because it provides the opportunity for the lender to understand, can you pay back the money that you borrowed, right? If the amount of revenue that you have left over is not sufficient to meet those principal and interest payments, that's going to be a red flag from a lender perspective, because they want to make sure that the money that they borrowed to you, they're actually going to be able to get back. So the recommendation that we often make is greater than 1.2. So making sure that you can cover your debt service payments, your principal and interest payments 1.2 times. And so we recognize that that's more than you would potentially need to set aside for your principal and interest payments, but it's always good to have a little bit of cushion. Again, those lenders are going to want to make sure they have their money back. They aren't going to want to just see that you have exactly the amount of money you need to pay them back. They're going to want to see a little bit of cushion on that. So we typically recommend greater than 1.2. Okay, so let's walk through another little example here, some math of doing the debt service coverage ratio. So now we're looking at the statement of cash flows for Mayberry. And this is, again, for their proprietary fund, so we know it's for their water sewer fund. And we come down here to item 4, and principal and interest are typically separated onto 2 separate lines. So make sure if you are looking for this within your financial statements, that you're looking for both of those lines and you're capturing both of those lines. So we can see that the principal paid on capital debt is $49,655, and the interest paid on capital debt is $35,128. And those are going to be important numbers whenever we calculate this indicator. And so, okay, we're going to need to harken back to some of the numbers that we talked about before. That's from the statement of revenues and expenses. We'll need the operating revenues, we'll need the operating expenses, and that depreciation value so that we can subtract it out. And then we'll need the numbers that we just pulled from cash flows. Yes. So let's go ahead and do some math here. Operating revenues, if you can remember, 444,231. The operating expenses, once we've taken out depreciation, is 368,985. And then for the principal and interest on long-term debt, we just want to add up those two values from the page before. The principal was 49,655 and the interest was 35,128. And so what you get here is $84,783. That's how much they pay annually in principal and interest payments. And so if we do the math here, if we subtract the operating revenues, or the operating expenses, from the operating revenues, and then divide that by the principal and interest payments on long-term debt, what we can see is that the number is less than 1. So this means that after Mayberry has paid all of their O&M expenses for the system, They do not have enough revenue left over to cover their principal and interest payments. So this would be something, if we were helping them with their rates, that we would also want to address. We would want to make sure that they were bringing in enough revenue whenever we were working on setting the rates for next year, perhaps, to cover these principal and interest payments, to make sure that they have enough money set aside. They don't have to pull from a reserve fund. They don't have to pull from their fund balance, anything like that, to meet these principal and interest payments. All right, the next indicator that we're going to talk about is days cash on hand. And so the way this is calculated is it's your unrestricted cash and cash equivalents over your operating expenditures minus depreciation. And what this tells you is how long you can continue to pay for O&M without any additional revenues coming in. And to calculate cash on hand, you need to know what your unrestricted cash and cash equivalents are. And basically your unrestricted cash and cash equivalents is the money that hasn't been committed to anything, the money that isn't restricted, right? It can be used for any of the needs associated with the system. And the number that we typically recommend is greater than 180 days. This is really just a utility or a kind of an industry standard, I suppose, for a recommendation for days cash on hand. And this metric, again, COVID is a great example of when we at the UNC-EFC really started to think about this metric. Again, there were moratoriums on shutoffs, right? There was no assurance that people were going to pay their bills. And so utilities had to really lean on the cash that they had on hand to make sure that they could basically level out any sort of fluctuations in revenues over that period. We also think about this indicator a lot when we think about like natural disasters. So we're in North Carolina. The eastern part of our state sometimes gets hurricanes, which can affect the ability to bring in revenue. It can affect the ability to deliver services. And so days cash on hand is, again, an important indicator for utilities from that perspective. Anything that's going to affect your ability to bring in revenue, your days cash on hand is going to essentially provide information on how long you can weather that storm. So in terms of calculating this, we'll go back to Mayberry. This time we're looking at their statement of net assets. Again, for the proprietary fund, we can see here that they've got cash, restricted cash, and net receivables. We're not interested in restricted cash. Again, for this indicator, we're just interested in the cash that can be used for anything. We want the cash that's flexible. So we're going to take that number 5 value, which is 107,706, and that net receivables value, which is 41,870. And then we're going to do some calculations here. So we've got our unrestricted cash and cash equivalents on top, which is 107,706. And then on the bottom, we want to know our operating expenditures excluding depreciation, which is going to be 511,448 minus that depreciation cost of 142,463, which we've done a couple times now, 368,985. We're going to take that value and divide it by 365 so that we can understand how much it costs to run the system each day, right? We know that costs don't balance out every day over the course of the year, but for the purposes of this metric, we're going to assume that it costs the same amount to run the system on October 1st as it does on February 1st. And what we can get, or what we find out, is that the system has about 107 days cash on hand. So again, this does not meet our industry standard, but this is pretty good. If we were to look at this, we would say this is pretty good. Going forward, there might be opportunities to try to set aside more funds to make sure that they can improve this value, but overall, 107 days for Mayberry is pretty good. All right. Next, we have the quick or current ratio, which is a measure of your short-term liquidity and just the ability of your utility to pay your current bills. And this is the one that I said was a snapshot in time, right? So it's based on whenever the financial statements were prepared and may not actually reflect the data that you have on hand today if you were to look at the finances of the system. But if you wanted to calculate this, the way that you would do it is to look at your quick assets, so your unrestricted items, including your inventories and prepaids, so all of those current assets divided by your current liabilities. And this tells us, with the current assets that we have on hand, if our current liabilities came forth and said we need all of our money today, could we pay them back? And so the number that we're looking for is greater than 1, right? We want to make sure that with the current assets we have on hand, we could cover all of these current liabilities at least. And so we've already pulled some of these numbers that are going to be important from the previous slide. We've got the unrestricted cash and cash equivalents and net receivables, which I pulled a few slides ago. So that 107,706, and then 41,870. And then you've got your current liabilities, which is 108,390. And so if we were to do this math, you can see probably just by looking at this that it's going to be greater than 1, right? Because our unrestricted cash is almost as equivalent to our current liabilities in and of itself. And so if we do this calculation, we can see that we get 1.38. So on the day that these statements were prepared, Mayberry had enough current assets, quick assets, to cover their current liabilities, and then some. And so again, these change daily based on how people pay their bills. So it also means that this ratio changes daily. And so it's just a snapshot in time. If this is something that you're interested in, that your utility is interested in, it's important to make sure that this is evaluated more than just once a year. If you have this information on hand, just go ahead and do the calculation throughout the course of the year. Again, if this is something that's important to your utility, if you think some of those current liabilities are going to be something that you need to cover soon, this could be something important to think about. And let's say you really enjoyed this exercise. We have a free tool available online on our website. You should have the PDF of these slides within the materials. So if you wanted to actually download this tool, you could. It currently is an Excel-based tool, but it is eventually going to be transitioned into an online tool. Right now, you'll find it as an Excel-based tool. You could download it. If you had the financial statements for your utility, you could basically walk through the different statements that we went through today, pull the information, put it into the spreadsheet, and then it'll spit out these graphs, right? So you'll see the dotted lines are going to be those industry standards that we talked about today. And then the solid lines are going to be the data that you input. And this is just sample data, so it'll look different for your utility. But if this is a relatively easy to use tool, we often recommend that people, give it a try if this is something that they're interested in. And additionally, we do provide technical assistance. So if this was something that you didn't feel comfortable doing or you just don't have the time to do, this could be something that we could plug in on and help evaluate for your utility. Okay, this is going to be the last section that we cover, which is the art of rate setting. Going to be very basic overview of rate setting. And like I mentioned before, we have a lot more resources if this is something that you're interested in. If you have questions on financial benchmarks, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. Happy to answer them. But if we don't have any questions, we're about to move into a poll. So I'll just go ahead and move forward. So rate setting, we're going to be talking about meeting that revenue requirement. We talked about what you might want to include in that revenue requirement if you want to cover the full cost of the system. Now we're going to talk about how you might approach getting there. So I'm going to launch a poll now. What we want to know this time is, when was the last time your utility raised rates? All right, and I'll give y'all about a minute on that one. All right, give you like 10 more seconds. If you haven't voted, make sure to get your vote in now. This is a good opportunity for me to get some water. All right, I'm going to close the poll. So this is great. The folks that we have in the room today have recently raised their rates. So this is great. I don't have to spend a tremendous amount of time, talking about the need to consider raising rates. It seems like y'all are kind of already on top of that, which is wonderful. So yeah, what I'm going to be talking about today are approaches that you could carry into the next time that you want to, consider raising your rates. They might be philosophies or things that you might want to consider. All right. Let's keep going. Okay, so when we talk about rates and rate setting, what we typically recommend is that whenever you're setting your rates, keep them simple. This is hugely important. The word itself is simple, and it seems simple in nature. But what we often find whenever we're looking at rates for utilities is that over time they've just gotten really complicated. Maybe there's a bunch of different customer classes, and each of the customer classes are approached differently in terms of how they structure their rates. And so it can be really hard to keep track of how much each person is paying, the rate structures, whether it's appropriate for how much it costs to actually provide them with that service. So we always recommend and lead with keeping it simple. We also recommend basing it on your expenses. So all the stuff that I talked about before, if you're looking at financial statements, that's a great starting place if you want to understand the expenses of the system when you're setting your rates. Making sure you cover your full costs. This goes back to the budgeting slides when we were talking about revenue requirements. And then also making sure you're thinking about your rates in terms of whether or not they're fair, right? Do they treat customers appropriately? Do they charge customers appropriately? Are they affordable? Again, this is based on your customer base, based on the folks that you know that live in your community and are connected to your system. Is it affordable for them? And is it equitable? What we don't recommend are rates that are super complicated. Don't make it harder than it has to be. Rates that are frozen in time, although that doesn't sound like it's an issue here because most folks have raised their rates within the past year. Shouldn't be based on political desires. Again, this should be something that's based on your expenses and covers the cost of running the system. And it also shouldn't be based upon your neighbors. And I know this one is tough because that's often what people will call about, right? Like their cousin lives in the next town over and they pay less for their wastewater bill than whoever the person is that's calling that lives in your jurisdiction. But it's important to make sure that you're basing your rates based on the cost to run the system. It could be that this is the next town over system has different costs, right? Maybe their costs are lower for running their system because people live in a much smaller area. It could be that it's a much larger system. There's a lot of different things that play into the costs associated with running a utility system. And so we typically don't recommend just relying on your neighbor's rates whenever you're setting your rates. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about objectives for water and wastewater systems whenever they're setting rates. And what we typically say is, you as utility folks may already know this information, but this is good information to try to communicate to the public or to your board or council when they want to understand your rate setting objectives. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on these here because I'll talk about them on the next few slides. Basically what you have are 4 key objectives, and the idea here is that as you move further along in one, right, like if you're really interested in maintaining affordability, it's going to make it harder potentially to cover the full cost of the system, right? So based on what your priorities are, they kind of pull across these axes. Same thing with encouraging conservation. If you really want to encourage conservation, it's going to be hard to also foster business-friendly practices. Because if you're trying to attract businesses that are going to be large users, it's going to be really difficult to both provide them with rates that attract them and make them want to stay, while also encouraging conservation. So we try to approach this as like trade-offs. It's going to be difficult to accomplish all of these, and so it's important to evaluate each of them individually and think about kind of where your system lies and what the priorities are for your system. So the first one we're going to talk about is full cost recovery and revenue stability. So this is basically just bringing in enough revenue to cover the full cost of running the water or wastewater system, both today and into the future. This is going to be your O&M costs, your capital needs, and any debt service payments that you might have. It's probably clear because you're at a financial management training why you might want to do this. But again, it gets back at those kind of key objectives associated with running the system. It's providing a public service, it's protecting environmental and public health, and it's a public enterprise. And the kind of crux of meeting all of those objectives is ensuring that the utility is sustainable. It can run today and run effectively today, but it can also continue to run effectively into the future. And making sure that there is enough money set aside to cover today's needs as well as future needs is kind of a key and critical component of making sure that you're providing that public service today and into the future. The next objective is encouraging conservation. And this is where you might use your pricing to encourage customers to reduce their water consumption. So an example of this would be like an increasing block rate, which is a term that's thrown around a lot. But basically the idea would be that you would set up your volumetric charge, that consumption charge, how much people are charged per 1,000 gallons of wastewater, so that it increases as people use more. That's a great way to encourage conservation because people are getting that pricing signal. As they use more, they get a higher bill, and thus they might be incentivized to use slightly less. In North Carolina, we had a really bad drought in like 2007, 2008, and the state more or less required utilities to implement increasing block rates during that time of an extreme drought, because it provided that pricing signal. It basically encouraged people to use less so that we could kind of navigate that drought in a state that's otherwise water rich. Of course, this does create some challenges. I mentioned this before. Business-friendly practices, right? It's going to be difficult to both encourage conservation and attract big users. Additionally, depending on the nature of your community, you might have a large family, multiple generations living in the same home, and potentially it becomes an affordability issue if they are using quite a bit of water or wastewater, are charged more, but don't necessarily have the ability to pay that. So you can think about how encouraging conservation, while there's just trade-offs, I suppose. It could be important for your utility based on your specific needs to encourage conservation, but also it does play into some of these other water system objectives. The next component is using pricing to encourage businesses and agriculture to locate to your community or stay in your community. So this is that business-friendly practices component. And this one is often pretty obvious to folks whenever we do these trainings, right? Bringing in businesses, economic development, it not only benefits the system in terms of increased revenues, but it also kind of has ripple effects within the community. Maybe it's increasing the tax base for the government itself, for the general fund. It could be that it's creating jobs within the community. It could be that it's leading to other development, right? Maybe if there's a big industry that's moving in and they're bringing in folks from another area. It could be that there's folks moving, right? So you've got the increased sales associated with the industry itself, but also that ripple effect as other people move into the area. So this one is typically pretty understandable for folks, but the important component of thinking about setting rates to foster business-friendly practices is to make sure that they're also fair. You don't want to penalize your residential customers just to attract large businesses or large industries. Just making sure that the way you're approaching the distribution of those costs is fair to all of your customers. And then finally, the fourth objective is maintaining affordability. From our perspective at the EFC, we're finding that affordability it's been an issue and it's continuing to be an issue. We're continuing to hear about concerns of affordability and affordable bills for folks in their community. And affordability is just ensuring that your customers are able, to afford enough water and wastewater service that they actually can live off of it. It gets back to that public service component. And it's important because water and wastewater systems are public services, right? They are providing basic needs for community members, and you want to make sure that it's not breaking the bank for the folks in your community who might be on a fixed income, right? Like it could be, we often use the example of the widow that lives alone who's on a fixed income, making sure that you're kind of providing appropriate guardrails so that that individual can continue to afford their water and wastewater services. The question we often get is, what is an affordable bill? And it's another answer of, well, it depends. There's no nationally accepted standard for affordability of water and wastewater service, although there are a lot of different people out there trying to come up with standards. Nothing has been accepted nationally or really pointed to as a very specific, this is affordable, this is unaffordable. What we typically recommend at the EFC is that, whenever we're working with communities or with utilities, those utilities know their customer base best. They know their community best. And so y'all are probably the best ones to determine, what does your community look like? What is an affordable bill in your community? And you can base that off of the customers that you know. You can base that off of US Census data. We also have a tool that allows you to pull in census data, basically household income data for your community, and then also put in your average bill at 4,000 gallons a month or whatever it may be, and look at what the burden is to the different folks who live within your community. And that's again something that we could assist with if folks were interested. So I'm going to launch a couple of polls here, give you a second to do something other than listen to me. So first, in terms of the objectives that I just talked about, first we want to know which of these is your number one objective at your utility. If you're not from a utility, you can just put in, what your number one objective would be if you worked for a utility. All right, I'll give you like 10 more seconds. Looks like most people have already gotten their answers in. Cool. All right, let's go ahead and close it. So a good mix, actually. Full cost recovery, encouraging conservation, business friendly. We, being the Environmental Finance Center, are always excited whenever people pick full cost recovery, especially for financial management training. But encouraging conservation, again, depending on where your utility is, your specific needs, the capacity of your system, conservation might be really important. And business friendly, we hear that a lot. Economic development is deeply tied to water, wastewater. So we often hear that, providing business friendly rates, making sure we're thinking about development is an important component of how we're setting rates. Okay, and I've actually got another poll. Now I want to know, what's your second objective? All right, it looks like most people have already voted, so I'll just give you like 15 more seconds. Okay, close it. All right, so much more even split this time, which makes sense, right? If you've accomplished your first objective, you're more likely to kind of have a distribution of objectives for the second one. So again, these are objectives that we've seen as important. No one picks something else, but if there was something else that you wanted to share, we're always interested in some of the other objectives that utilities are facing, just so that we can make sure that the information that we're portraying it reflects the reality for folks that are working at utilities. Okay, so we'll just keep rolling here. So when we're talking about full cost pricing, the goal here is to charge for the water or sewer services to cover the entire cost of running the system today and into the future. If there's one thing you've probably taken away from this training, it's that the full cost of running the system is not just the cost today. It's the cost today and into the future. And there's many different ways to calculate that, and that really just depends on your rate setting philosophy. So I mentioned earlier that the revenue requirement is the science of rate making. Everything that follows after that is really just more of an art or a philosophy. And in the interest of time, I've really shortened this to provide kind of a few key approaches for rate setting philosophies. We have a lot of other resources on how to set rates, and I'm more than happy to share those with anyone who might be interested after the fact, because there are many, many different ways to approach rate structures, to approach rate setting. Keeping it simple, again, is very important, but maybe your utility is just kind of curious what's out there. We're happy to share information that we have. Some of the different philosophies that we see is payment for access versus payment for volume of product received. So this is basically the idea that should someone pay purely just because they have access to the service, the infrastructure, right, to get to them, versus should they just pay for the commodity itself? should they just pay for whatever they use? And so the payment for access, an example of that would just be like a fixed rate. So if it costs $35 for wastewater service, no matter how much wastewater was sent to the wastewater treatment plant, that would be payment for access. The idea is that folks are just paying because they have the ability to send wastewater to the wastewater treatment plant. It doesn't matter how much they send. The opposite would be if there was no like fixed charge, it was purely based on the amount of wastewater that was sent to the wastewater treatment plant. So instead of having a fixed rate, we might have a rate that's just based on like thousand gallons of wastewater. And those are kind of two extremes. What we often see is kind of a mix, right? So we'll have some sort of base charge, some sort of fixed charge for access, and then we'll also add on some sort of volumetric charge, some charge based on the amount of service that's provided. We also see sometimes that when folks are setting rates, they'll try to align the fixed charges, right, those base charges for the fixed costs associated with running the system, and variable charges for the variable costs. So the fixed costs are those infrastructure costs, right? They're the things that don't change based on the amount of wastewater that's treated. The variable costs are the things that do change. So the variable costs will be like utilities, right? You may pay more in energy costs if you're treating more wastewater, and thus we want to make sure that we're capturing that in our variable charges. In general, the costs of running water and wastewater systems are mostly fixed. So what we often see is kind of, like I mentioned before, that base charge, that volumetric charge, it might not be a perfect match for the fixed costs and variable costs of running the system, but it's kind of based off of that and then based off of the objectives of the system themselves. So in terms of do's and don'ts in rate making, this is actually don'ts and do's, I suppose, but we recommend not designing rates without understanding your revenue requirement. Again, you want to start with how much money do we need to bring in to cover the costs. Don't make it too complex. Again, keep it simple. We do not recommend just having one big increase. People really don't like that. If you can do kind of incremental increases over time to get you to where you need to be, that tends to be much better than just one giant increase. And don't just count on growth. Growth is not, it may happen, but it should not be what you count on whenever you're setting your rates or whenever you're trying to meet that revenue requirement. What we do recommend is to be conservative. It's always better to be conservative than to kind of shoot for the moon and not hit the moon. We do recommend considering risk, right? So I talked about kind of the appetite for risk at your utility. You could think about, if you're trying to figure out how to set your rates based on the amount of wastewater that's used, you can think about, well, maybe we're going to have greater use next year because we might have some growth. You could use that as one potential scenario. You could use no growth as a scenario. There's a lot of different ways that you could approach kind of some of these scenarios if you wanted to think about different ways of approaching your rates. We recommend thinking about price elasticity, which I have not mentioned yet, but it's basically the idea that as your rates go up, people will use less. It's that price sensitivity kind of thing that I talked about within the encouraging conservation component. We do recommend giving decision makers options to consider, right? Presenting them with options so that they can consider different scenarios and maybe how they'll improve financial benchmarks. And we always recommend communication, making sure that you have a story to tell and that you're telling it so that someone else doesn't tell it, right? If you need to increase your rates, make sure that you're explaining why you need to increase your rates before someone else comes and says you're increasing your rates for an entirely different reason. We also have another Excel-based tool, kind of similar to the financial health checkup tool that I mentioned before, that's specific to rates. So if this is something that you want to play around with, it's also available on our website. You're more than welcome to download it. This one's a bit more complicated, and we do offer technical assistance if you wanted assistance with kind of looking at your rates, maybe looking at different scenarios for how you might want to set your rates in the future. This is something that we can certainly help with, but maybe you have the capacity in-house, you're just interested in playing around with a tool. It's free and available on our website. And there are also additional resources, not just UNC-EFC specific, but that are part of the EFCN, the network itself of those 10 organizations. There's our State Revolving Funds Switchboard, which provides you with information on the state revolving funds for all the states, and that's hosted by the Southwest EFC. And then we also provide funding tables, water and wastewater funding tables. So we basically inventory all the water and wastewater funding sources that we know of in each of the states. We update it on an annual basis, and that's free and available on the EFCN's website. So again, you have these materials, you can click these links, access this information. The funding tables people often really like. They're very accessible, and they provide contact information. It's just a helpful tool and pretty easy to download and to understand. If based on everything I talked about today, you find that you are interested in technical assistance, you can go to the EFC Network website and request technical assistance there. We are more than happy to provide technical assistance to small wastewater systems. We also, UNC EFC, provide technical assistance within Region 4, which includes Kentucky. So we have opportunities to provide technical assistance if you know of folks who maybe operate a water system who are interested in technical assistance. We have other ways of figuring out how we can assist you. So if anything we've talked about today is of interest to you and you wanted additional support, I encourage you to fill out that technical assistance form. And now, with 5 minutes remaining, I will pause and see if there are any questions from anyone in the audience. I do really appreciate y'all taking the time to listen to me for 2 hours today and listen to Melanie for 2 hours tomorrow. I hope this was helpful. If you have questions, I definitely encourage you to reach out to me or to Melanie both now or tomorrow if something comes up between now and tomorrow. We're more than happy to answer questions for y'all. If you don't have any questions, I don't think we have anything else for today. So you can enjoy the extra 4 minutes of time, I guess, that I provided you, which is not very much, and hopefully have a great lunch, great rest of your day, and we will see you tomorrow. Thank you all.
Christy?
I can try to help. I don't know that I can. Oh,
Oh,
Christy's back.
okay. I was just wondering, as soon as we end this, the recording will be saved, right? I don't need to do anything weird on my side.
Sorry, eating lunch. I will go in. The recording will automatically be produced. I will go in and make sure it gets published. So the email is not supposed to go out until Friday.
Okay.
So there should be a copy of them both recordings that goes into that email for everybody.
Awesome.
Great.
Austin, can
All
you
right.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Chris. Hi.
Hello. When we get done with this, will we get a certificate? What do we need to do about getting the hours to Kentucky Department of DCA? Will you all do that for us?
So I'm glad I have Christy on here because she can correct me whenever I say something that's inevitably wrong. But the information that Melanie provided initially, your email address, if you complete the polls, if you kind of do check all the boxes, then you will get an email probably from, I think, Syracuse's EFC within 30 days about your continuing education units.
Okay.
Yes, that should be correct. There shouldn't be anything additional that you need to do, Chris, as far as I know.
Okay. All right. That'll be great. Thank you all.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Have a good one.
You too.
All right, I'm going to sign off. I thought that was great.
Okay, great.
I'll
Yeah.
see y'all later.
Okay, sounds good. See you, Christy.
Bye, Christy.
All right, Justin or Chris, do y'all have any other questions for us? If not, we'll probably sign off as well. if you have questions, you can always bring them up tomorrow. We'll both be on tomorrow as well.
Okay, see you then. Thanks.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
All right, I think we're good, Melanie.
Yep, me too. All right, cool.
All right, see ya.
Bye.
Bye.